welcome to the show this week. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, I'm delighted that we have with us today a guest who's been on the channel pretty much since we started. Peter Hitchens, of course, is columnist for the Mail on Sunday, but also writes for numerous other publications, and indeed is the author of some 9 books now, Peter?
I think it is actually 9 books.
Welcome.
It's a joy to be here again.
And you are inaugurating our new set, which means a lot to us, if not to you.
I'm thrilled.
But I think it looks great.
I like your picture.
Yes, I think it sums sort of everything up in a way, actually.
I always like the memento mori on the bottom.
Well, it was a way of getting kids interested in art. They used to get kids, when I was young, to go and stand over here and then you could see the skull.
Oh, you can see the skull, yeah.
But more prosaic matters, as you put. We are recording this exactly a month to go before the general election. If there was some kind of, sort of people sitting here saying, what should we do, Peter? What should they do?
Well, my simple, absolutely incredibly simple rule is vote against Starmer and his party, whatever the arrangement is, if you can, if you live in a constituency where your vote counts. I personally, I've put that in because I personally live in a constituency where my vote would make no possible difference because it's a safe Labour seat. But if you live in a constituency where your vote counts, whatever you do what you can to prevent a victory by Starmer's Labour Party. That would be my absolute rule.
So won't that mean for a lot of people voting for the Tory party?
No, it doesn't mean voting for anybody. I think people have to master the fact that in this country now, where we have not for many years been presented with parties which have any interest in what we think or feel, you must learn to vote against. And often in voting against, you'll find yourself giving your vote to a party you might well despise, as I despise the Conservatives.
I know that when we've talked before, and you've written obviously a lot about it, for you, the year with the Conservatives was about 2010, wasn't it? That was the last time that you thought it was...
No, I go back further than that. I began to develop my dislike for the Conservative Party around the time of the defenestration of Ian Duncan Smith. It wasn't that I thought Ian Duncan Smith was a good leader. I don't think he was. He was a terrible leader. But the way in which he was removed and the purpose of his removal and what seemed to me to be the collaboration between the left-wing media classes and a large part of the Conservative Party in removing him and the subsequent coronation of Michael Howard was an extraordinary event, and it persuaded me that the certain positions simply were not allowed to be represented in British democratic politics anymore. And the other thing which I became increasingly persuaded of was that when David Cameron, again I believe helped strongly by Michael Howard, became the leader of the Conservative Party, his purpose was to Blairize the Conservative Party, and it was basically a bloodless putsch in which the Conservative Party became part of the Blairite apparatus. And if people voted for David Cameron's Tories in 2010, I reasoned, they would be endorsing and ratifying this change and accepting that the Conservative Party would henceforth be a Blairite party. And the other point that I felt very strongly at the time, people would often say, well, we've got to get Gordon Brown out. And I would reply, why? In some important aspects, I think especially on the European single currency, I still think Gordon Brown was considerably to the right of David Cameron. And I strongly suspect that on a number of social issues, the same thing was true. Also, by then, New Labour was washed up, burnt out, lacking in energy or direction, had no particular new policies. We could have afforded an interlude of a weak, battered, lifeless Brown government while we reconstructed conservatism in this country. And it was an amazing opportunity. And I tried to get anybody else to see it. And I couldn't. A lot of people were very rude to me. I lost a very old friend over it, I remember. And I approached other national newspaper columnists who I thought might sympathise with my strong fear of what David Cameron was doing, and they wouldn't help. So I was completely on my own. The worst moment of it all was a debate which I held through Intelligence Squared in London, where I thought I'd had a debating partner, and we would debate this against Michael Gove, amongst others, and make the point that Conservatives were not actually a Conservative Party and needed to be replaced. my debating partner, who I won't name because he's dead now, and I don't see any point in jumping on his tombstone, pulled out at the last minute, leaving me on my own, totally as I had been in all the time I've been writing about this in this paper. And I just thought, this is one of the worst moments of my life. I went ahead. They very kindly, one of the Intelligence Squared people, very kindly did a sort of professional debating job of being at my side. So there were two on my side. But I thought, this is catastrophic. Why is it that this extraordinarily important message can't get a platform? Why will nobody take it seriously? I carried on saying it, but I have to say after the 2010 election, in which a lot of what I said was borne out by the fact that Cameron couldn't in fact win it. But after the 2010 election, I carried on saying it with less and less conviction, because it seemed to me that the ratification of the Blairisation of the Tory party was complete, and that really, as a result, the country was finished. And when this election came up, what I'm basically saying is the country has had it, but you can head towards perdition quickly and deeply unpleasantly, or you can head towards perdition more slowly and less unpleasantly. And faced with that choice, I really wouldn't want to accelerate it by putting Starmer in government. Starmer is not some kind of moderate. He's a highly dogmatic, very left-wing person. And I'm qualified to know that because I understand the British left. And the other thing is this: I'm haunted even by my memory of the 1997 election, where again I felt strongly. I'd been told by an old friend who was part of the New Labour apparatus that the project was far greater than most people understood. I was haunted by the feeling that the whole of Conservative Britain had resigned itself to a Blair government on the basis of, it's their turn, it doesn't matter, Blair's really a Tory. And I thought this was completely wrong, and I believe that was borne out. I mean, remember, let's take three very simple things. When the Blair Labour Party stood in 1997, they said nothing about Bank of England independence. They said nothing about their grotesque and enormous raid on private pensions. And they said nothing about their planned constitutional revolution, in which they put Alistair Campbell and Jonathan Powell in charge of civil servants, although they had no elected position and were not responsible to either House of Parliament, there were other things they did, I know, in constitutional revolution. But these three enormous things, which they did very rapidly, were not even spoken of by them in their manifesto. And it's just, I keep looking at the Starmer Labour Party and how little they actually tell us about what it is they're going to do. And I harbour in my mind the dread that within a few weeks of Starmer walking into Downing Street, we will see so many extremely well-planned, powerful blows struck at what remains of the constitution and economy of this country, that people will be amazed. And they'll say, why did we let that happen? So I said, why bemoan it now? Why wail about in the streets, tearing your hair in July and August, when you can do something about it now? Don't be beguiled. Don't let these people in.
Thing is, I mean, although I totally see your position now, I get it. But, quite often you have said that this Tory party is the, obstacle to a real Conservative party.
Well, I agree, it was, but that moment has passed. There was a lot more of Conservative Britain still standing in 2010, and a lot more Conservative-minded people still active in public life in 2010, and in the professions and in the media in 2010 than there are now. I take an example of this. I mean, the BBC, for instance, it was a lot more impartial in 2010 than it is now. It had, for instance, it had a lot more willingness to let me on, and now I practically can't get on. There are one or two small bits of it I can still get into. But by comparison with the access I had in 2010, the revolution which has taken place since the Conservative Party was Blairised, and since basically the two major parties became really part of the 1968 revolution, which they now are in social and cultural terms, is enormous. And the damage that was done during the Cameron government and what followed to what remained of Conservative Britain is such that I can't really see any prospect of constructing a replacement party. All I can see is what I refer to as Thatcherite tribute bands. Bodies of people have very scanty understanding of what the issues are, and can only really think of sort of reviving Thatcherite slogans and Thatcherite ideas to give us some idea of what it is they believe in. Someone the other day sent me a summary of the Reform Party's proposals, and one of them was a British Bill of Rights. Apart from the fact that David Cameron used to speak of the same thing, how can any British patriot not know that we already have one?
So you don't see them as a kind of possible replacement?
It doesn't look like it to me. They're not conservative. They're basically economically liberal. They tend rather more towards Liz Truss than towards Edmund Burke, I think, to sum it up.
So in other words, by that logic, even to vote reform would be maybe a bad thing?
It's not about even in a two-party system, and I favour the two-party system and I've written in defence of it, but it is the case. Only two parties can win. And I know people say, well, what about the polls? They now show reform creeping up on the Tories. I am extremely doubtful about the accuracy of the polls. Or maybe it's the accuracy of the way their research is being portrayed. I wrote a long essay about this because it interested me greatly about the way the polls behaved, particularly towards Cameron. You may remember that before the 2010 election, there seemed to be a general belief that Cameron would sweep in with a majority. I didn't believe it, so I asked the polling companies for their raw data. It was obvious what was going on. They were getting huge numbers of people refusing to say how they were voting. And so what the great swings that they were portraying were actually swings among quite a small proportion of the surveyed electorate. It's not. And the other thing I point out here, when opinion polling was devised by Dr. Gallup before the Second World War, it was easy to go and knock on people's doors. They'd come to the door. There were much fewer houses with multiple occupation. People stayed where they are. And then in recent years, until about, I suppose, 10 years ago, people, if you rang them up, answered the telephone. Now, neither of these things are true. How are the polls actually getting their data these days? And is it as reliable as it was? I published the other day, I went down to one of my favourite resorts, which is the Times room in the London Library, where they keep bound volumes of the Times. And I got out the edition for June the 18th, 1970, a day I remember very well, which said 3 opinion polls say Labour to win. And then I got out the beautiful 5 a.m. election edition of June the 19th, Conservatives on course for victory. And you've just seen, it still happens. Narendra Modi, everyone was saying Narendra Modi in India was going to cruise in with a huge majority. And he hasn't got it. Polls keep getting it wrong. They got it wrong in the 1992 election. People thought that Labour would win, and they didn't. And the other great example, of course, was 1964, when everybody thought Harold Wilson would walk it. And he ended up making it with a majority of only 4. And if the Tories had tried a little bit harder, they could have beaten him. And it may well be that it was the demoralization caused. And this is so important about polls. The demoralization caused by the certainty of losing that ultimately caused them to lose. This is why I say to people, don't be so gullible. Don't be so easily manipulated. It may be these polls are wrong. Don't vote according to what you think everybody else is doing. Vote according to what you think is right. What I think is right is, for heaven's sake, stop Starmer. People don't know about it. I write about it. It's been in the papers. It's not. Starmer is, by his training and by his political activity in his 20s, not as a student, as a child, as a grown man. He was a thing called a Pabloite, which is a very sophisticated form of Trotskyism, a red-green revolutionary. That's what he was. He also joined as a lawyer. There are 2 societies for Labour supporting lawyers. One is the Society of Labour Lawyers, which is exactly what it says it is, and the other is a body called the Haldane Society, which at the time he joined it was generally thought to be rather close to the Communist Party. I say this over and over again, nobody pays any attention. He's not, this is as an adult, as a lawyer. He was interviewed by the New Statesman and asked 2 or 3 years ago, was he still red-green? Well, he said, absolutely, yes, I am. He doesn't hide it.
But why do you think then, Peter, that he doesn't get, for example, that kind of scrutiny from mainstream media?
Well, partly because if you haven't been a Marxist-Leninist, you don't understand these categories.
Yes.
When I say he's a Pabloite, I say it because I know it. I get a frisson in comprehension every time I say it, because it's quite fun getting that. But even to use these terms, these technical terms, to most people, what is this mad world?
Yeah.
But it exists. Pablo was the nom de guerre of an amazing Greek revolutionary called Michaelis Raptis, who did time, bizarrely enough, in the Netherlands for running guns to the Algerian rebels in the 1950s. He founded this tendency, and its magazine in England was edited by one, Keir Starmer.
Yes, yes.
These things don't. People, they're not uninfluenced. I'm still influenced by my Marxist-Leninist past, but as you will have noticed, I go on about it. I'm public about it, and I never pretend otherwise. And I don't have to be asked about it to let you know. I even put in my Who's Who entry that I did a stint on the Socialist Worker, just in case anybody's in any doubt. It's voluntary on my part. Most of the people on the modern left who were mixed up in revolutionary movements in the 1960s and 1970s or later don't talk about it because it still matters.
There were quite a few in the Blair government.
Oh, and many, including Blair himself, who only admitted to having been a university Trotskyist to Peter Hennessy long after he left office. It was a very closely guarded secret until then. Imagine if people had known that Blair had been a Trotskyist when he was being Mr. Nice Conservative. It might have been a bit of an upset.
You said that he was far more radical than, say, Jeremy Corbyn would have been.
Well, this is Peter Hyman, his own close aide. This is Peter Hyman's version of a fascinating article in The Observer a few years ago. We are more radical. We Blairites are more radical and more revolutionary than anything Corbyn could think of. He said it. It's not me saying it, it's them saying it.
What do you think of the view that part of their kind of revolutionary agenda in the Constitution, that is what needs to be repealed if we're to make any kind of progress? That in fact, the way they changed, for example, the Equality Act, this is during the New Labour, the Supreme Court, all of these changes, that actually just has to be rolled back, and then we've then got some chance of actually making a change.
Well, yes, but indeed. But how do you get the head of steam into the political system, which makes you capable of doing that? How do you get the people in Parliament to understand it, who can put through the repealing legislation? The difficulty at the moment is so many people on the alleged right have a very, very limited understanding of what the Blair Revolution entailed. And again, there's this fascinating document. Gordon Brown swims into view again here. On constitutional change, which is in existence. And the only serious review of it is by a man who goes under the pseudonym J. Sorrell, writing for Toby Young's Free Speech Union. Fascinating dissection of this extraordinary document. And if it's implemented, which I think it will be, its immense effects on what remains of the sovereignty of the House of Commons. Not to mention the reforms of the House of Lords. I think constitutional change is cheap. It doesn't cost billions and billions of pounds. I think that Starmer will go for it. But as I say, there's almost no analysis of it among conservative journalism, apart from this one, this is pseudonymous article on Toby Young's where I've made some allusions to it. But it's huge if so. And we still suffer from the constitutional changes of Blairism, apart from the breakup of the country and the surrender to the Irish Republican Army, the complete swamp which they made out of the House of Lords, which is now so bad that not even Conservatives can defend it, I don't think, which has to be reformed. And what will it be when it's reformed? It'll be another single list system, alternative vote, PR chamber, totally responsible to the executive and without any independence at all. A nightmare. I would think that's bound to happen. And when that happens, another small piece of the defences of liberty will have been knocked away. These are huge things. But the Supreme Court and its role in the Blairite Revolution is also gigantic. And its role in this Brown plan in confining the powers of Parliament is quite considerable. These things are worth looking at. I only say, yes. I can't predict what they're going to do. I think it's very reasonable to suspect they will do a lot of very radical things. They also, I think, are bound to move quite strongly on tax. there'll be something equivalent to the raid on the pension funds. I suspect that the weaponizing of council tax as a wealth tax is probably the way they'll do it.
One thing that really concerned me, actually, and indeed the people who watch this channel, was that Labour have adopted, all parties have adopted, apart from the Tory party, this new definition, for example, of Islamophobia, which, and they will probably therefore embed it into, I think it's called a Race Equality Act they're going to do. Now, Peter, I mean, apart from not making sense, I think it's hatred of Islamophobia is rooted in racism. That's how it starts, and perceived hatred of perceived Muslimness. I mean, it's illiterate almost.
Well, I agree. It makes you despair. Unless you were a believer, and I'm a Christian believer, so this is a different question for me. Unless you're a believer, a religious affiliation is basically, it's a political statement with which you can disagree. I'm perfectly ready to accept that a lot of people will disagree with my Christian interpretation of the universe, because it is a set of opinions which to them, if they are not believers, have strong political implications, and they're entitled to disagree. And I think it's the same. I actually get on quite well with Muslims when I argue with them, because it's enjoyable. But I disagree with them, and I say plainly to them. I was having dinner with some very interesting Muslims a few weeks ago, and set out some of my disagreements, particularly over the attitude towards women, and it's perfectly possible to do so. But I suppose it's risky if such a thing becomes enshrined in law to say these things, because then it's a phobia, and it ceases to be. But I think the threat to the freedom of speech in this country grows every morning. There simply is, and for people like you and me, we can still, because we've got reasonable platforms and because there is still something of a conservative media in this country to sustain us, we can still say things which, if we were working for a local authority, or indeed working for somebody contracting for a local authority, might well get us either sacked or our business destroyed. There's an illusory freedom among the commentariat which is not shared by poor people working hard for a living out in the provinces. It just isn't there for them.
Yes. Absolutely. I think it is quite frightening, in particular when you look at what happened in Scotland and the hate speech bill and these sorts of things. I just want to go back to something you said. When you were talking about journalists, with a few exceptions, not really taking on board any of these, say, constitutional questions, do you just think that the calibre of both journalists and politicians is just deteriorated?
No, I don't want to make personal aspersions on people. It's just the nature of... I don't think that political journalism in this country was ever that good. I think that the parliamentary lobby, certainly by the time I got into it in the 80s, had already become, if it hadn't always been, I don't know, I hadn't been there before, to a great extent a gossip factory of who's up and who's down, of the extraction of leaks by the method of lunch, rather than the reporting of the actual workings of government, which I think it ought to be. But then that was transformed for the worse, to some extent, by Bernardino, and then much, much more, I mean, exponentially more, by Alistair Campbell's methods. That it became true in political journalism that for most people, your career was advanced by your being open, how shall I put it, to a certain amount of seduction by the political party in power. You get the big stories if you're close to us. If you don't, then you're frozen out. I think there's a lot of that. And there's very, very few people who were able to resist that. I don't blame the people involved, but you read the way it goes, it seems to me to be quite obvious that some sort of system of this kind has remained in place ever since Alistair Campbell developed it. Are you a friend or are you not?
When you look at this election going on now, as I say, basically, well, by the time this goes out, about 3.5 weeks. I mean, you've covered a lot of elections, Peter, haven't you? I mean, not as a political...
Yeah, I did. I think the first one I did would have been, 80... which one was it? Was it 83? Was that the disastrous moment? Was it 82 where 83 goes now? That one was the first one I was hugely involved in. I took part in the 1979 election campaigning for Ken Livingstone in the Hampstead constituency in London.
Oh, really?
Well, I was in the Hampstead Labour Party at the time, and although I'd voted against him at the selection...
In 79?
Yeah, selection meeting.
Yeah.
Although I'd voted against the selection meeting, I felt that party policy required me to campaign for it. I knew he'd lose anyway. So that was, I think, the last time I campaigned an election.
Well,
with Ken.
But, I mean, people say, oh, well, no one's really taking much notice. Maybe a little bit more now because of...
83, it was 83, I'm sorry.
83.
82 was the full terms. I couldn't have been 83.
But it is...
I can usually but I get a bit mixed up in the 80s.
It is extraordinarily hard to be interested when you look at, this election. It's just hard for people. I mean, in some ways, is it not a completely realistic response to actually not be that bothered?
Well, it's interesting if you're me, because I'm not sure the polls are right. And I do think that it's vitally important for the country that Starmer is defeated. And if you take on those things, it will become interesting for you too. I can quite see why if you don't take either of those views, it is a bit dull.
Can we just talk a little bit about another election coming up actually in November?
Yeah.
In America. I mean, to go in at the deep end, if you like, there is this sort of a view that in fact it is so divided now, America, that in fact whatever happens in this election might actually precipitate some kind of real social breakdown in America.
Who's to say?
Do you think that...
I haven't been there I don't like going there anymore. I used to love it. I lived there for a couple of years. I had the most wonderful time. I travelled everywhere. I got to know it as a landscape and as the big cities and everything else. I liked many aspects of the way of life, and left in 95 and went back many times. There are two things that have this. One, my brother lived in Washington, D.C., and it was, if ever I was there and he was there, then Washington, D.C. was sparkling and interesting for me. Now he's died and isn't there anymore. That city has lost an awful lot of the allure it used to have, even though I lived there once myself. But also as a place, it's just become, in some strange way, darker, poorer, less enjoyable, and I don't feel happy going there. I don't particularly like doing it. So I'm out of touch.
Yeah,
I haven't been there long enough, but my impression is that it's pretty grim. And what I used to say to American liberals when I lived there, I said, look, because I would be at some dinner table in Washington, and I would say what I thought, and they would despise me instantly because I was still a conservative. I said, it's all very well you thinking that people like me are knuckle-brushing morons, but we actually have quite reasonable suggestions to make, and the things that we would like you to do and not do are not unreasonable. But if you carry on not listening to us, then you will get something much worse than us. That's what I used to say.
yes.
And that thing, which actually, in my view, has been conjured out of the ground by American liberalism, is Donald Trump. He is the nightmare that they made by ignoring intelligent and thoughtful conservatism. I can't stand him, and it makes me shudder to think of him becoming president again. But then again, people say, well, do you want Joe Biden? I keep saying, it's not about that, is it? I don't, because it's not, you don't have to support City because you don't support United, or the other way around. I can dislike both of them and want both of them to lose. There are so many conflicts in which I want both sides to lose.
The thing is, though, you say about not liking going to America, but it seems to have become darker. I know exactly what you mean. I used to spend an awful lot of time. I lived there like you, and 5 years, and then also was going backwards and forwards all the time. I've totally lost interest in that, and I for me anyway, it is about the kind of what used to be the dominant culture of America no longer is.
No.
It seems to me.
But also it was so free. You could ring up anybody and they would talk to you. You could go to the airport. People would come to the steps of the plane and wave you off. You could travel everywhere for not very much. Stay in cheap motel. I travelled to almost all the states. It was so easy. it's now become a nightmare travelling. Ever since September the 11th, you're treated as if you're a newly convicted prisoner for daring to want to go on an aeroplane. All this rubbish of security and taking off your clothes and having your genitals x-rayed. I just can't bear it. And also it has become everything, the infrastructure is gone. When I went to live in Washington in 1993, the metro, the lovely underground railway, was still quite new. Beautiful, actually, in many ways, and very impressive, and extremely efficient. When I used it a few years ago, it was crummy, and they'd been having crashes on it. And you thought, and just things like that. The whole feeling this was a better run, more prosperous place than this was, for instance, has gone for me, and the exhilaration of it has gone.
It's also cliche maybe, but it's also that sense of confidence, which is why a lot of English, rather uptight English people went to America as well, was this kind of openness. And it's, as you say, and it seems to me that can be found, but it's not the
It can be found. There are still very good things which can be found, but it's harder to find them.
Yes. I want to ask Peter, you obviously wrote one of your books, Abolition of Britain, some time ago, but it's still in print, isn't it?
So it is.
And it was actually written, if I remember, a few years after 97?
Almost immediately afterwards.
Almost immediately.
Published in 1999. I did most of the writing of it during 1998.
And it is still in print,
It's still in print, yeah. I won't change it.
Yes.
I've occasionally written new introductions and prefaces to it, but I won't change it because I know that if I once start unpicking, I'll have to rewrite the whole thing, and I'm just not prepared to do that.
Yes.
I think it stands as well. There are bits in it which I would now repudiate or wouldn't want to say. Not so much repudiate as having been wrong as I wouldn't give them the prominence I gave them at the time, and bits in it which I think write better now than I did then. But in general, I'm happy to stand with it as a. But the thing is, I wrote it as a manifesto for political action. I intended it to be a point at which conservative-minded people could look at the state of the country and see what needed to be fixed and how it could be fixed. And I very rapidly realised that nothing of that kind was ever going to happen. So it became an obituary, which is what it now is.
Yes, but, okay, if you could indulge me for a minute, you say that there were certain things there that should be fixed, but that was not going to happen. What actually would those things be? I mean, because the rot seems so deep.
The crucial one had to be, and this to me, ever since I lived in the Soviet Union, this has been the absolute turning point and the axle on which everything turns, would be the end of the attack upon the married family, right, and the end of the attack on private life, which had been so strongly conducted since the 1960s. That's what I wanted. And I didn't want some kind of devil-era family constitution. I still don't. I think it's unreasonable to tell people how to live. But actually what I believe is that the liberal elite, a term which I used at the time, quite uniquely, I think it's caught on for some reason. And they had really since the 60s been attacking the idea that people lived in married families, that marriages stayed together and should be helped to stay together rather than encouraged to break up by the law. And that also the idea that a parent, I'm not dogmatic about this, that a parent should stay at home with the children should be normal. Those two things by themselves would be so transformational. And I mentioned the Soviet Union because I knew everybody, when I went to live in Moscow, everybody knew that the Soviet Union was poor, that it was grey, that things didn't work, that the consumer goods were in short supply, that people lived in horrible blocks of flats, and that there was a secret police force. What I didn't fully realise until I went to live there was how intense the Soviet state and the Communist Party's war against the family had been and still was, and what an important component of communism that was. And I came away from the Soviet Union having learned a huge number of things about myself and about the world, but that was the most important political thing that I learned, that the family versus the state is the real struggle of the 20th and 21st century.
Is it also because the family, is the absolute root and bedrock of everything else in our society.
Completely. But if you have no private life, and if you have, and if the state is the main parent in terms of bringing up and supplying ideas to the children, the fact for else you will lose the continuity. You will lose centuries of continuity of the passing on of law and language, which we have lost in the country.
I mean, just to press you a bit more on that, how would one roll back that attack on the family, apart from just stopping?
Oh, well, goodness, I could have told you this in detail with legislative suggestions in 1999. But I think almost anybody looking at the effects of the 68 Divorce Law Reform Act and the damage that did might at least say, shouldn't the divorce law discriminate between couples with children and couples without? Shouldn't it be harder to get divorced if you've already embarked on child rearing than otherwise? No such provision is in the law. You put that in for a start. I mean, that's just an example of the sort of, and you need to look at it in a way of, wasn't this 1968 Divorce Law Reform Act a bit radical? Didn't it actually leave an awful lot of children deeply unhappy and feeling terribly deserted? Wasn't that a mistake? But there's been no revision of it.
What about the Abortion Act of the same year?
Well, it's a fascinating thing, the abortion law, because we already had legal abortion in this country before David Steele's Act. There was a particular case which took place in 1938, in fact, when I think a 14-year-old girl was raped just off Whitehall by a group of soldiers, and her mother went to a particular doctor who was very much against abortion, but on that occasion said that he would very exceptionally perform it. Promptly having done so, went round to the police and reported himself, was put on trial and acquitted. Because the jury thought, in my view, quite rightly, that there are moments when the criminal law is obviously cannot be made to apply.
Yeah.
You can't even codify it really. But what this meant was that there was ever afterwards, until 1967, an understanding in the law that there were exceptions. And there were quite large numbers of abortions going on actually in National Health Service hospitals as well as in private clinics before 67. Quite large numbers by the standards of the time on the basis of this law. And what the 67 Act did was transform this very conditional and actually quite clever compromise into what was in effect abortion on demand. Now here's a fascinating thing about this. The pro-abortion people at the time and since for many years would say, Hillary Clinton used to say in America, that abortion should be safe, legal and rare. And this phrase, safe, legal and rare, was in the Democratic Party's policy documents until a few years ago. But now the abortion campaigns say, why should it be rare? What's wrong with abortion? And they've had that removed. They don't really have a fundamental opposition to the destruction of unborn babies in the womb. They don't see anything wrong with it. So I think it was a huge moral transformation. Of course, it lays the foundation for all kinds of other the end justifies the means sort of legislation, which we now find in the campaign for assisted dying, which in my view will go the same way. I mean, everybody knows perfectly well that there is a certain amount of informal assisted dying going on in NHS hospitals as we speak. But if, under certain circumstances, of course, the police can be called in and it can be investigated if people get suspicious. But so there's a sort of parallel to the abortion law. But if assisted dying becomes legal, then I think you'll find that it becomes exponentially more numerous than it is now. Because it's ends justify means legislation. Once you go that way, there's almost nothing you can't do.
It's very interesting, actually, that you pointed this to. I don't think most people would have expected an answer from you about the family, actually, so I'm thinking of. You know, that this.
Well, I have lots of other things. There's many other concerns. I could go on at length about the grammar schools about which I wrote a book, and the disaster of comprehensive education. I could go on about the destruction of the police and of the criminal justice system, about which I've also written a book. I could go on about the relaxation to the point of inanity of any kind of attempt to control illegal drugs. Over and over again, there are lots of things, but absolutely central to me remains this issue of the married family. I think it's so important that it has to be stressed. There is nothing more important. And the strong state is its enemy. A weak, or how shall I say, a gentle state is not the enemy of the family, but a strong state, such as we have been acquiring since the 1960s, is its enemy.
Well, Peter, thank you very, very much for that. Actually, we have a few questions for you, for our members, if you just stay with us for a while. But in the meantime, thank you very, very much for joining. Peter Hitchens there. We shall see you next week. Thank you. Have a good weekend in the meantime. Bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.